so much, and it's so wonderful to be here to present what is Human Rights Watch's first major report on tax. In fact, as I was researching this report, sometimes I was asked, what is the connection between tax and human rights? And I think Sri Lanka is a particularly powerful illustration of the connection between the two. There's the obvious point, right, that low revenues contributed to the economic crisis in 2022 that was devastating and still is for human rights. But the connection goes much deeper than that, to the very structure of Sri Lanka's economy and its ability to deliver on human rights. What this report shows is that decades of tax policies that favor corporations and the wealthy have contributed to the chronic underfunding of Sri Lanka's public education system. The report looks at education, but a similar report could be written about health, about social security, and other economic and social rights. Because under human rights law, governments have an obligation to take steps to the maximum of their available resources to realize economic and social rights. And that means that they need to mobilize the resources to do this and to spend at levels adequate to do this, something which Sri Lanka has clearly been failing to do. Taking the lens of education, by the time the crisis hit in 2022, Sri Lanka's spending on public education as a percentage of GDP was the third lowest in the world at 1.5% of GDP. But this rock bottom came after decades of decline. In fact, in the 10 years prior to the crisis, education spending averaged below 2% of GDP. To put this in perspective, the international benchmark for education spending, for minimum levels for an education system, are 4 to 6%, which means that Sri Lanka was spending half to a third of achieving this minimum level. So the report asks two questions. One is why? Why is Sri Lanka spending so little? And two, what is the impact of Sri Lanka spending so little? On why, we come back to tax. What's somewhat unusual about Sri Lanka is that public education spending used to be much higher. Following independence, it was around 3 to 5% of GDP. In fact, as many of you probably know, Sri Lanka was a global leader in education. It was among the first countries in the world to establish free education for primary and secondary school for most Sri Lankans. Tamils of Indian descent were, of course, excluded. But the education funding, especially in rural areas, was really important following independence as part of a larger suite of public social spending to reduce inequality and to increase social and economic mobility and remediate the policies of colonialism that had concentrated power into the hands of a small elite. Of colonialism that had concentrated power into the hands of a small elite. And all of this was financed by tax, which was around 20 to 25% of GDP. Then beginning in the late 1970s, we have a shift to focus on growth with a deliberate deprioritization of social spending, but also using low taxes as a way of promoting growth, especially corporate tax exemptions. And so you have a decrease in trade taxes and other taxes without any progressive tax system built to essentially ensure that the state benefits from the ensuing growth. And this creates two things that are really important for human rights. First, the government is simply not collecting enough revenues to support the levels of social spending it was previously able to do as a share of the economy. And the second is that it begins to rely very, very heavily on regressive taxes that essentially fall hardest on those who are poorest. So essentially, it is making the poor pay taxes while those benefiting most from the growth get away with paying very little or nothing at all. And all of this is wrapped in a culture of corruption, impunity, and elite capture that enables this broken tax system and contributes to the loss of public revenues. So here we can see the decline of taxes as a percentage of GDP and the extent to which the system is reliant on regressive taxes. And what we see is that tax and education run parallel to each other. So as there's a decline in tax revenue as a share of GDP, we also have a decline in education spending. And this runs parallel to an increase in inequality. So whereas there was a significant drop in inequality, this is the Gini index, following independence, it begins to rise again and is actually peaks at higher than it was at independence. When we look at it as a share of the amount of wealth owned by the top 1% versus the bottom 50%, we see the same trend. I don't want to oversimplify things or come off as naive about pre-1977 economic policy or suggest that there is like one simple policy line since then. Obviously, there are fluctuations in economic realities and policy responses. There's a civil war. But in considering how to rebuild the country after this economic crisis, which is where we are right now, I think it's very important to locate the structural root causes that led not only to the crisis, but to the fraying of the social contract. And the report shows that one of these root causes is a focus on growth to the exclusion of ensuring it benefits people through the realization of their rights. Now, this is not a problem exclusive to Sri Lanka. On the contrary, Sri Lanka was kind of swept up in an economic approach that gained dominance at the time of this shift, and is part of a global economic system that influences and shapes its economic realities. It's on its 17th IMF program. Its tax system is also heavily influenced by the global dimensions of tax, which include what's often called a race to the bottom, which incentivizes this harmful tax competition between companies to try to pay as little taxes as possible, risks of capital flight for taxing personal wealth. There is research complicating both of these points, but I also want to highlight two developments on the international level that are really important for creating an enabling environment for Sri Lanka to be able to raise taxes in line with its ability to meet its human rights obligations. The first is ongoing negotiations for the first ever UN tax convention on international tax cooperation, which was brought by the Africa Bloc at the UN, and negotiations will continue next month in Nairobi, which is itself a really important development in that it's an effort to shift economic decision-making from the OECD, from international financial institutions, which are heavily controlled by wealthier countries, to a more democratic forum. And it is also a historic chance to really address some of the root cause issues that drive Sri Lanka's and countries, in similar situated countries, the challenges in raising progressive taxes. The second is a more modest process, but it still has a transformative potential, which is a process to develop metrics of economic progress that go beyond GDP that is also being led by the UN. Before closing, I want to go back to the question of impacts. What is the impact of Sri Lanka spending such a small percentage of its GDP on education? The good news is that Sri Lanka has a strong foundation, which surfaced very much in our research. 97% of students are in the public school system. There are high literacy rates, high enrollment rates, but decades of underfunding are showing. And I want to highlight two ways in which that's the case. The first is that because schools have such bare-bone budgets, they're essentially, government is paying for teacher salaries and textbooks and not much more. Schools are relying on students and outside sources of funding for very basic resources. So they do this through school development fees, exam fees, but also relying on alumni, which is one, a very big financial burden for many families, especially following the economic crisis. But secondly, creates these disparities in resources. So you have, for example, students, teachers telling us in a public school in Colombo that alumni are paying for smart boards and chemistry labs, whereas in other areas of the country we're hearing about schools where there are not enough chairs for students. The second is the rise of the tuition system, which has many drivers, but one of them is linked to the under-resourced schools and low teacher salaries. and people we spoke with, tea plantation workers who were paying a large part of their income to make sure that their kids go to these classes because they believed it was critical to their education. And all of this, of course, has become compounded by the cost of living crisis since the economic crisis. And it's beginning to show up in the data around widening disparities between richer and poorer students, which is especially tragic when you kind of go back and think about the beginning of post-independence Sri Lanka, where education funding was such an important way for enabling social and economic mobility. And now the underfunding is creating these widening disparities. And I understand that the government is taking some really important steps to address some of the issues that I raised, but what we want to really urge is to make sure that the reforms go deep enough to fundamentally shift economic policymaking to center human rights, or simply put, to enable a human rights economy. Thank you.